Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer taunted investigators with letters filled with ciphers and gruesome details about his crimes. He claimed responsibility for several murders in Northern California during the late 1960s and early 1970s, and described them with disturbing precision. In one letter, he included a cipher that took months to crack and revealed his sick obsession with fear. He struck near Vallejo, Benicia, Napa County, and San Francisco between 1968 and 1970, mostly targeting young couples in parked cars. He used small caliber firearms and knives, attacking quickly and without warning. The attacks appeared calculated, with some victims ambushed from behind. His letters often included threats, puzzles, and demands for publicity. One note featured a crosshair symbol with the word Zodiac, which became his chilling signature. In another letter, he warned that more people would die if the press ignored him. Investigators matched several attacks by ballistics and through his detailed confessions. One surviving victim gave a description, but it was vague. He once sent a bloody piece of a victim's shirt to a newspaper, proving he was the killer. Despite collecting fingerprints and handwriting samples, the police never identified him. The ciphers ranged from simple codes to complex puzzles. One of his most famous ciphers stayed unsolved for over 50 years. Even now, one full cipher remains unbroken. Dozens of suspects were examined, including convicted criminals and well-known figures, but no suspect was confirmed. DNA tests ruled out some names, but not all. His final confirmed letter arrived in 1974, then he disappeared. He never admitted to stopping and never got caught. The case's open status keeps fueling theories, documentaries, and public fascination. His cryptic clues, violent methods, and total disappearance make him one of the most terrifying killers who was never brought to justice. Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper haunted the streets of London's Whitechapel district in the late 19th century, targeting women in a brutal series of killings that shocked the city. Between late August and early November of 1888, 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were found murdered in horrifying fashion. Their throats were slashed, and several were mutilated post-mortem. These weren't random acts. The killer showed anatomical knowledge, removing organs with alarming precision. Letters signed Jack the Ripper began arriving at police stations and news outlets. Some included threats, while others mocked the investigators. One infamous letter came with half a kidney, allegedly taken from one of the victims. The killer claimed he had eaten the other half. Investigators at the time couldn't confirm the letter's authenticity, but the detail was disturbing enough to shake the public. Police interviewed hundreds of suspects and followed up on every shred of information. They even brought in early criminal profilers and increased patrols across Whitechapel. Still, the killer vanished into the fog. There were no fingerprints, no conclusive eyewitnesses, and no arrests. Despite all the attention, Jack the Ripper slipped away. Theories about his identity never stopped. Some suggested he was a surgeon, others a butcher, and a few even accused royals or artists. Over 100 suspects have been named in the years since, and DNA testing has been tried on old evidence, though nothing has ever stuck. Some letters were confirmed hoaxes, but a few still raise questions. Jack the Ripper's crimes weren't just violent, they were methodical. The killer selected vulnerable targets and operated under the cover of night, blending into the chaos of Victorian London. No one saw him clearly, no one stopped him, and his identity remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. Feel free to smash that like and subscribe button for more content like this. Anyways, Long Island Serial Killer. The Long Island Serial Killer is linked to the deaths of at least 10 people, whose remains were found along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach between 2010 and 2011. Most of the victims were women who had worked as escorts, and many had been missing for years before their remains were discovered. Some were wrapped in burlap sacks, showing a level of planning and an effort to conceal. Investigators first discovered the remains while searching for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert. Though her case was later considered separate, it led to the discovery of several other bodies in the same general area. The remains were spread out across multiple locations, including Gilgo Beach, Oak Beach, and Jones Beach Island. The killer appeared to target vulnerable individuals, and the method of disposal was consistent enough to suggest one person was responsible for many of the deaths. Despite extensive searches and forensic testing, the case dragged on without resolution. Authorities pursued leads for over a decade, using phone records, DNA analysis, and even facial reconstruction for some victims. One of the major challenges was that some remains were found in different stages of decomposition and had been scattered across multiple counties. The killer's familiarity with the area and the choice of disposal sites suggested local knowledge. Investigators believe the suspect may have had a background in law enforcement or emergency services. Theories swirled, suspects were questioned, and even a task force was formed, but nobody was charged for years. Some of the victims still haven't been identified, others were known by aliases used on online platforms. The killings abruptly stopped, or at least no further linked victims were found. The case left a chilling legacy of unanswered questions and frustration for both investigators and families. The Long Island serial killer remains unidentified. Monster of Florence. The Monster of Florence terrified the region of Tuscany between 1974 and 1985, murdering 8 couples in secluded areas near Florence. The attacks were all shockingly similar. Each time, the killer struck late at night, ambushed the victims in their cars, and used a .22 caliber Beretta pistol with Winchester Series H bullets. After shooting, he mutilated the female victims with a knife, suggesting a disturbing ritualistic pattern. The first known attack that was later linked to the monster occurred in 1974, when a couple was murdered while sitting in their car. Initially, that case was treated as isolated, but by the early 1980s, a pattern emerged. Over a decade, 7 more couples were murdered, and all the crimes showed the same terrifying consistency in method and weaponry. The killer always left the male victim shot and the female victim mutilated. In some cases, body parts were removed and never recovered. Investigators believe the killer watched the couples before striking, often choosing isolated lovers' lanes. The brutality and repetition left residents in fear and police scrambling for answers. Multiple suspects were arrested and released over the years. At one point, local authorities believed the murders were connected to a group or a cult. Others thought it was a lone killer with a personal motive. Several suspects, including Pietro Pacciani and his alleged accomplices, were tried, but none were definitively proven guilty. Pacciani died before his retrial, leaving the case tangled in controversy. Despite thousands of interviews, handwriting analysis, and ballistic evidence, no one has ever been conclusively linked to all the murders. The monster's identity remains unknown, and the case is still technically open. The level of violence, the precision, and the fact that no one was ever caught keeps the Monster of Florence one of Italy's darkest unsolved mysteries. Highway of Tears Killer. The Highway of Tears refers to a long stretch of road in British Columbia, specifically Highway 16, where dozens of women, mostly indigenous, have gone missing or been murdered since 1969. The exact number is unclear, but some estimates put it at over 40. Most of the victims were last seen hitchhiking along this isolated highway, often trying to get to school, work, or home. The area's remoteness, combined with limited public transportation, made hitchhiking a necessity for many. Several of the cases share eerie similarities. Victims were young, female, and disappeared under similar circumstances. Bodies were sometimes found off the highway, while others were never recovered. Despite numerous investigations, task forces, and public campaigns, many of these cases remain unsolved. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police acknowledged that some may be the work of a serial killer, or possibly multiple killers operating over the decades. In 2010, a man named Cody Legabakov was convicted for the murders of 4 women, one of whom had connections to the region. Another man, Bobby Jack Fowler, was tied to a victim through DNA, but he died in prison before facing trial. Still, these arrests account for only a small number of the disappearances. Investigators have struggled with limited evidence and a long timeline that stretches across decades. Many of the cases went cold quickly due to lack of witnesses and the vast wilderness surrounding the highway. Activists and families of victims have long criticized authorities for slow responses and failure to take the disappearances seriously, especially when the victims were indigenous. The Highway of Tears remains one of Canada's most haunting crime corridors. While some killers have been identified, the vast majority of cases tied to this region are still unsolved. The full truth remains buried in the forest beside that road. The Doodler. The Doodler operated in San Francisco during the mid-1970s, targeting gay men and leaving behind almost no evidence. He got the nickname because several survivors said he sketched his victims before attacking them. Police believe he killed at least 5 men between 1974 and 1975, though some estimates go higher. The bodies were found in parks and near beaches, often stabbed repeatedly and left in secluded spots. Victims shared key similarities. They were often well dressed, appeared to have met the killer in clubs or bars, and had no signs of a robbery. Authorities suspected the killer lured them with charm or artistic talent, then attacked them once they were alone. Some victims had defensive wounds, suggesting they fought back. At least 3 men survived attacks and gave statements to police. One was a well-known entertainer, another a diplomat. Because they feared being outed in public, they refused to testify, which blocked prosecutors from pursuing charges. Investigators identified a suspect early on, even interviewed him, but without witnesses willing to testify, they had no legal grounds to arrest him. The case went cold despite the suspect being questioned multiple times. Police kept the file open and occasionally revisited it, especially when new forensic techniques became available. In recent years, the case was officially reopened, and authorities released age-progressed sketches of the suspect and offered rewards for information. Still, no arrests have been made. The Doodler's attacks caused panic in the city's gay community, especially because the crimes weren't widely publicized at the time. The mix of social stigma, fear, and lack of hard evidence helped him slip through the cracks. His identity remains a mystery, the victims never got justice, and the Doodler walked away without being held accountable. Bible John. Bible John was active in Glasgow, Scotland during the late 1960s, linked to the murders of 3 women between 1968 and 1969. All 3 victims had been at the Barrowland Ballroom shortly before they were found murdered. The killer targeted women leaving the venue alone or with him, and each was sexually assaulted and strangled with her own clothing. The victims were Patricia Docker, Jemima McDonald, and Helen Puttock. They were all found in different areas of the city but showed chillingly similar injuries and patterns. Helen Puttock was the only one seen leaving with a man, and her sister, who shared a taxi ride with them, later gave a description. The man quoted Bible verses, criticized drinking, and mentioned he didn't attend the Barrowland regularly because of the behavior there. That led police to dub him Bible John. The killer was described as tall, with reddish hair, well-spoken, and appearing educated. Despite the detailed witness account, no suspects were ever charged. Police interviewed thousands of people, created composite sketches, and ran forensic tests, but nothing led to an arrest. Years later, some believe the crimes might be linked to Peter Tobin, another serial killer who frequented the same clubs and was active during that time. He matched the physical description and had a violent history, but no definitive connections ever been made, and he died without confessing. Bible John's identity remains unknown. The crime stopped after 1969, and many believe he either left the area, was jailed for something unrelated, or died. The case remains one of the most notorious unsolved serial killings in Scotland's history. The religious references, public setting, and lack of resolution have kept this case in the public eye for decades. Freeway Phantom. The Freeway Phantom murdered at least 6 young black girls in Washington, D.C. between April 1971 and September 1972. The victims were aged between 10 and 18. Each disappeared while doing everyday things like going to the store or walking home. Their bodies were later found alongside highways, dumped in grassy or wooded areas near major roads, which earned the killer that nickname. All the victims were strangled, and some had signs of sexual assault. The killer often removed their shoes and personal items, possibly to avoid leaving forensic evidence. In one chilling case, the victim Brenda Woodard was found with a note stuffed in her pocket. It was written in a disturbingly calm tone and signed Freeway Phantom. The note used proper grammar and punctuation, which led some investigators to believe the killer was educated and methodical. Despite clear patterns in the victims' profiles and the disposal method, the investigation struggled. The racial bias in the system at the time meant these cases didn't receive the same resources or attention as others. Leads came and went, including a group of suspects known as the Green Vega Rapists, who were questioned but never charged for these murders. Local law enforcement and the FBI worked the case, but they never found enough evidence to make an arrest. Forensic testing years later couldn't link any DNA definitively to a suspect, and many of the original case files were lost or incomplete. The killer stopped after the 6th victim, or at least no more linked cases surfaced. The case remains open, but there's been little movement. Families of the victims still push for justice, and every few years, new attention brings it back into the spotlight. The Freeway Phantom vanished without a trace, leaving behind fear, grief, and unanswered questions. Axemen of New Orleans. The Axemen terrorized New Orleans from May 1918 to October 1919, attacking at least 12 people and killing 6. He usually broke into homes at night by chiseling out a panel on the back door, slipping inside without waking anyone. Once in, he used an axe, often the victim's own, to bludgeon the occupants in their sleep. The victims came from different backgrounds, but most were Italian grocers, which led some to believe the attacks were racially or economically motivated. Others thought it was personal. There was no consistent pattern in age or gender. Sometimes he attacked couples, other times individuals. Some victims survived, though with severe injuries and no clear memory of the attacker. The most bizarre part of the case came in March 1919, when a letter supposedly from the Axemen was published in newspapers. In it, the writer claimed to be a demon and promised to spare anyone whose home was playing jazz music on a specific night. That night, the city pulsed with jazz from nearly every house and club. No attacks happened, and the Axemen vanished for months after. Investigators were baffled. The method of entry was consistent, but nothing was ever stolen, and the murders didn't appear sexually motivated. Dozens of suspects were questioned, some arrested, but none were charged. Several false confessions only complicated the case. The axe itself was usually left behind, and any fingerprints were useless due to forensic limits of the time. Despite heightened patrols and citywide panic, no one ever saw him enter or leave a scene. After one final murder in late 1919, the attacks stopped as suddenly as they began. The axeman was never identified. His motives, identity, and reason for stopping are still unknown, leaving one of America's strangest serial killer cases wide open. Cleveland Torso Murderer. The Cleveland Torso murder struck during the 1930s, leaving behind at least 12 confirmed victims, possibly more, whose dismembered bodies were found around the Kingsbury Run area in Cleveland, Ohio. The killings happened between 1934 and 1938, and the brutality made them unforgettable. Victims were decapitated, many while still alive and often dismembered with surgical precision. Some bodies were missing limbs or torsos altogether, and in several cases, the heads were never found. The victims included men and women, many of them unidentified to this day. Most were transient or living in poverty, which made identification difficult. Some were found dumped in plain sight, others in remote spots, suggesting the killer knew the area well. The use of lime on some bodies showed he tried to speed up decomposition, while others were washed clean. Elliot Ness, Cleveland's safety director and already famous for going after Al Capone, personally got involved. He ordered parts of the shantytown near Kingsbury Run burned down in hopes of flushing out the killer or cutting off his access to victims. That controversial move didn't stop the murders. Police had suspects, including a doctor with a suspicious past and access to medical tools. He was committed to a mental institution but never charged. Ness believed he was the killer but didn't have enough evidence to prove it. Other suspects were questioned and cleared, and eventually the investigation lost momentum. Some thought the killer moved or was arrested for something else. Others believed he stopped voluntarily. The gruesome precision, careful disposal, and the variety of victims left authorities stumped. The Cleveland Torso murderer's spree ended without resolution, and his identity still a mystery. The sheer horror and mystery surrounding the case kept it alive long after the bodies stopped appearing. Colonial Parkway Killer. The Colonial Parkway Killer is believed to have murdered at least 8 people in 4 double homicides between 1986 and 1989 along or near the Colonial Parkway in Virginia. All the victims were young couples, found in or near their vehicles, often in remote areas known for being quiet and scenic. The attacks occurred under different circumstances but shared haunting similarities. The first case involved Kathleen Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, found in Thomas's car pushed down an embankment near the parkway. Their throats had been cut, and diesel fuel was poured over the bodies, possibly in an attempt to burn the car, though it was never set on fire. Later, victims were either shot or strangled, with no clear pattern in weapon choice, but a consistent focus on couples and isolated locations. Some victims were found in vehicles with signs of a struggle. Others disappeared without a trace, and their remains were later discovered in woods or ditches. In each case, robbery didn't appear to be a motive. Personal belongings were often left untouched, and there were no indications of sexual assault. The killer's motive seemed calculated and specific, not random. Investigators initially didn't connect the cases, but over time, the pattern of targeting couples and the remote crime scenes pushed them to suspect a serial killer. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, were involved, but the case stalled without a suspect. Family members of the victims pushed for answers, and over the years, new evidence was re-examined using modern forensic tools. Despite renewed attention, including DNA testing and behavioral profiling, no one's been charged. The killer stopped as abruptly as he started, and the case remains open. The Colonial Parkway Killer left behind grieving families, cold trails, and a reputation as one of Virginia's most baffling unsolved cases. West Mesa Bone Collector. The West Mesa Bone Collector is linked to the discovery of 11 women's remains buried across a remote patch of land on the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. In 2009, a woman walking her dog stumbled upon a human bone on the West Mesa. That single find led investigators to a massive burial site. Over the following months, they uncovered skeletal remains of women and one unborn child, all of whom had disappeared between 2003 and 2005. Most of the victims were Hispanic, involved in sex work, and had histories of drug use. They vanished from Albuquerque streets with little attention until the mass grave was uncovered. Their remains were buried in shallow graves, spaced apart in a way that suggested planning and familiarity with the terrain. Investigators believe the killer used the area regularly and knew how to avoid detection. Despite the size of the burial site and the number of victims, no one has been arrested. Several suspects were considered, including a man who lived nearby and had a history of violence toward sex workers. He died before investigators could question him thoroughly. Others were investigated, but nothing concrete linked anyone to the crimes. The location of the graves was set in an undeveloped area that later became a construction site. Some remains may have been destroyed during early construction phases before the area was secured. The lack of surveillance, witnesses, or forensic evidence slowed progress, even with assistance from federal authorities. To this day, the West Mesa bone collector has never been identified. The case remains one of the most disturbing and tragic cold cases in New Mexico history. 11 women were buried in the desert, their disappearances ignored for years, and their killer vanished without leaving a name or trace behind. Phantom Killer. The Phantom Killer is blamed for a string of brutal attacks near Texarkana in the spring of 1946. He attacked 8 people between February and May, killing 5. The crimes happened late at night on isolated roads or lovers' lanes, always targeting couples. He wore a white mask or sack over his head, according to the only 2 known survivors, and struck with a chilling blend of precision and rage. The first 2 victims survived the assault but gave vague descriptions, shaken by the sudden, violent ambush. The next 2 weren't as lucky. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were found shot to death in a parked car. Over the next few weeks, more bodies appeared. Some were shot at close range with a .32 caliber pistol, others were beaten savagely. There were no signs of robbery or personal motive, and the killer left little physical evidence behind. Local police and the Texas Rangers launched a massive investigation. They stopped cars, questioned suspects, and even used decoys to lure the killer. Multiple people were arrested, including a man named Yoel Swinney, who became the prime suspect. His wife claimed he confessed, but she later refused to testify, and he was never charged with the murders. The city was paralyzed with fear. Shops closed early, residents armed themselves, and some even fled. The killer vanished after the final attack, and no confirmed murders were linked to him again. Authorities believed he might have moved or died, but they never found out who he was. Dozens of theories surfaced, from war veterans to escaped criminals. Every few years, someone claims to have cracked the case, but the evidence never holds. The Phantom Killer disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind horror, chaos, and a mystery that still haunts Texarkana: Honolulu Strangler. The Honolulu Strangler murdered 5 women between 1985 and 1986 on the island of Oahu, making him Hawaii's first known serial killer. All the victims were women between the ages of 17 and 36. They were abducted, sexually assaulted, and strangled. Their bodies were dumped near highways or remote locations, often with hands bound behind their backs. The first known victim, Vicki Gale Purdy, was found near Kihei Lagoon after being reported missing by her husband. Over the next year, 4 more victims appeared: Regina Sakamoto, Denise Hughes, Louise Medeiros, and Linda Pesci. The pattern was unmistakable. Each victim vanished while alone, often near bus stops or on their way home from work. The killer struck swiftly and left no useful evidence. The bodies were often found days after disappearance, clothed but arranged in ways that suggested the killer wanted them to be discovered. Law enforcement formed a task force, used roadblocks, and interviewed hundreds of people. A psychological profile described the killer as an opportunist with deep-seated resentment toward women. One major break came when a witness saw a man with one of the victims near the time of her disappearance. That led police to a suspect who matched the profile and failed a polygraph test. His girlfriend said he'd returned home on the night of one murder in bloodstained clothing. Despite this, there wasn't enough physical evidence to charge him, and the case stalled. No further murders occurred after the suspect was under surveillance, but no arrest was made. The murders abruptly stopped in mid-1986. Authorities believed the suspect was likely the killer, but without a confession or DNA proof, they couldn't prosecute. The Honolulu Strangler vanished without punishment, leaving behind 5 families and one of Hawaii's most chilling unsolved mysteries: I-70 Killer. The I-70 Killer is linked to a string of murders in the spring of 1992 across the Midwest, mostly near Interstate 70. He targeted young, brunette women working alone in small retail stores. In total, 6 people were confirmed dead between Indiana, Missouri, and Kansas. Most victims were shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber weapon. Execution style. One victim was a man, but he resembled the female victims and may have been mistaken for a woman due to his long hair. The killer struck quickly, taking little to no money. Robbery clearly wasn't the motive. He chose quiet shops with minimal foot traffic, slipped in, shot the clerk, and left. In some cases, customers found the victims shortly after the murder. He never wore a mask, and several witnesses described him as a white male, in his 20s or 30s, with sandy blonde hair, a slender build, and a cold demeanor. Despite the consistent method, the killer left almost no forensic evidence. He used the same gun, but shell casings were wiped clean. Investigators worked with the FBI to produce behavioral profiles and composite sketches, which were circulated across multiple states. After May 1992, the murders suddenly stopped. Then, in 2021, new evidence connected him to 2 unsolved murders in Indiana. Surveillance footage and ballistic testing renewed interest, and the FBI offered a reward for information. Despite these developments, he remains unidentified. The I-70 killer displayed planning and control. He never lingered, never escalated to more chaotic crimes, and always left before anyone could react. The randomness of his victims, the broad geography, and the silence that followed make this one of the most disturbing and frustrating unsolved serial cases in American history. Connecticut River Valley Killer. The Connecticut River Valley Killer is suspected of murdering at least 7 women in New Hampshire and Vermont between 1978 and 1988. All the victims were young to middle-aged women, mostly last seen near their homes or traveling alone. They were later found in wooded areas, often stabbed multiple times with shocking ferocity. The number of stab wounds sometimes exceeded 20, suggesting rage or compulsion. The first known victim, Catherine Milliken, disappeared after going birdwatching. Her body was discovered a month later. Over the next 10 years, more women vanished or were found dead under similar conditions. Most of the bodies were located in remote forested spots near the Connecticut River, and nearly all showed signs of overkill. Some were partially clothed, but there was rarely evidence of sexual assault. The attacks appeared to involve both planning and opportunity. Victims were often alone, either hitchhiking or driving, and there were rarely witnesses. Forensic technology at the time offered little, and crime scenes yielded almost no physical evidence. Local police struggled to find connections until patterns became undeniable. One major break came in 1988 when a woman named Jane Borowski was attacked in her car. She survived, despite being stabbed over 20 times. She later gave a description of the man: white, with dark hair, and driving a Jeep Wagoneer. Her account supported the theory that the killer was mobile and likely familiar with the area. Despite the detailed witness statement and composite sketch, the killer was never found. Borowski's survival was the last known contact. After her attack, the killing stopped. Some believe he moved, was imprisoned, or died. The Connecticut River Valley Killer vanished without explanation. The motive, identity, and reason the spree ended remain unknown. The fear he left behind still lingers in that region. Feel free to smash that like and subscribe button for more content like this.